Somewhere in a government building right now, there are files that have never been fully declassified. Files describing what scientists did to human beings when nobody was watching. Not in some distant dictatorship, not in a history book, in hospitals, in prisons, in schools, on soldiers who didn't know they were part of an experiment, on children who couldn't say no. The things humans have done to other humans in the name of science are not ancient history. Some of them happened in your lifetime. And the people who authorized them were never punished. Before we get into the experiments themselves, you need to understand one thing. The concept of informed consent, the legal requirement that a patient must be told what is being done to their body and must agree to it, did not exist as enforceable law until 1964. Before that, there was no legal framework stopping a doctor, a government agency, or a university researcher from using human beings as test subjects without telling them. The ethics existed. The laws did not, and the distance between those two things is where the darkest chapter of modern science was written. Let's start with the one most people have heard of, because most people have not actually heard the full story. The Tuskegee syphilis study began in 1932 in Alabama. The United States Public Health Service recruited 399 black men who had syphilis and 201 who did not. They told the men they were being treated for bad blood, a local term covering a range of ailments. They were not being treated. They were being watched. Scientists wanted to document what untreated syphilis did to the human body over time. When penicillin was confirmed as an effective cure for syphilis in 1947, the researchers did not give it to the men. They actively prevented the men from receiving it elsewhere. The study continued for 40 years. By the time a whistleblower ended it in 1972, 28 men had died directly from syphilis. 100 had died from related complications. 40 wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The men never knew they were in an experiment. They were told until the very end that they were receiving treatment. There was no treatment, but Tuskegee is the experiment people know. Here is one they don't. In 1956, researchers at Willowbrook State School on Staten Island began deliberately infecting children with hepatitis. Willowbrook was an institution for children with intellectual disabilities. It was severely overcrowded and had a persistent hepatitis outbreak. The researchers, led by Dr. Saul Krugman, argued that since the children would likely contract hepatitis anyway, it was acceptable to infect them deliberately in a controlled setting to study the disease. They fed the children hepatitis-infected feces in milkshakes. Parents were told their children were receiving an experimental treatment. Some parents were told the only way to secure admission to the school, which had a waiting list, was to enroll their child in the study. The experiments continued for 14 years. Krugman received awards for his research. He was never charged with a crime. And then there is MKUltra. In 1953, the CIA launched a program designed to develop techniques for mind control, interrogation, and psychological manipulation. The program was called MKUltra, and it ran for 20 years. It involved over 150 separate research projects across 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, and mental health facilities across the United States and Canada. Subjects were given LSD without their knowledge. They were subjected to electroconvulsive therapy at intensities that erased memory. They were kept in sensory deprivation for weeks. They were hypnotized, drugged, and psychologically broken in systematic attempts to reprogram human behavior. One of the CIA's own employees, Frank Olson, was dosed with LSD without his knowledge during a work retreat. 9 days later, he fell from a New York hotel window. His death was ruled a suicide. His family has argued for 70 years that it was not. When a congressional investigation finally forced the CIA to release documents about MKUltra in 1977, the agency admitted the program had existed. It also admitted that most of the files had been destroyed in 1973, 2 years before the investigation began, on the orders of CIA Director Richard Helms. What was recovered was a fraction of what existed. Most of the victims were never identified. Most of the researchers were never named. Here's what none of these experiments have in common with what you might expect. They were not conducted in secret basements by rogue scientists. They were funded by governments, approved by institutions, published in academic journals, awarded with grants and medals. The Willowbrook experiments were published in prestigious medical literature. The Tuskegee study ran with the full knowledge of the CDC. MKUltra was authorized at the highest levels of the United States government. These were not aberrations, they were programs. And they were not uniquely American. In Canada, a psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron received funding from both the CIA and the Canadian government to conduct what he called psychic driving, a process he believed could erase mental illness by wiping a patient's mind and rebuilding it from nothing. His patients at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal were put into drug-induced sleep for weeks or months at a time. They were subjected to repeated electroconvulsive shock at doses far beyond any accepted medical standard. They were played recorded messages on loop, sometimes for 16 hours a day, designed to implant new behavioral patterns. Many patients came to Cameron seeking treatment for moderate conditions: anxiety, depression, minor personality disorders. They left unable to remember their own names, unable to recognize their families. Some regressed to a childlike state they never recovered from. Cameron died in 1967 before he could be held accountable. The Canadian government settled with survivors in 1992. The CIA settled with survivors in 1988. Nobody went to prison. What the Nuremberg Code was supposed to prevent was exactly this. After the Nuremberg trials exposed what Nazi doctors had done to concentration camp prisoners, hypothermia experiments, pressure experiments, surgical experiments conducted without anesthesia on conscious human beings, the international community established the Nuremberg Code in 1947. 10 principles. The first and most important, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The Tuskegee study was still running. MKUltra had not yet begun. The Willowbrook experiments were 9 years away. The Nuremberg Code was adopted, and then ignored. Here is the part that sits with you after everything else. The experiments didn't stop because someone grew a conscience. They stopped because journalists found out. The Tuskegee study ended because a public health service employee named Peter Buxton leaked documents to the press after years of internal complaints were ignored. MKUltra was exposed by a journalist named Seymour Hersh, who reported on CIA domestic activities. The Canadian experiments were uncovered by survivors who pieced together their own medical records decades later. In almost every case, the institutions responsible did not come forward. They were found out, and in almost every case, the response was not criminal prosecution. It was apology, settlement, commission, report. You are almost certainly descended from someone who lived during these experiments. The Tuskegee study ran until 1972. MKUltra ran until 1973. The Willowbrook experiments ran until 1987. If you were born before 1987, these experiments were happening during your lifetime. The scientists who conducted them attended the same conferences, published in the same journals, and received the same grants as every other researcher in their fields. The question that nobody has fully answered is not whether these experiments happened. The documents confirm they did. The question is how many documents were destroyed before anyone could ask. Because here is the thing about the files that have never been fully declassified. We know they exist because of the ones that were. Every FOIA request that returns partially redacted pages is a window into a room we are not allowed to fully enter. Every destroyed archive is a silence that has already told us something. And every settlement paid to a survivor without admission of guilt is a government calculating that the cost of honesty is higher than the cost of silence. The experiments are over. The institutions are still here. The question of what they are capable of, that has never been fully answered either.